Friends, welcome to Word on Fire Catholic Ministries. Word on Fire is an apostolate dedicated to the mission of evangelization, using media both old and new to share the faith on every continent and to facilitate an encounter with Christ and His Church. The efforts of Word on Fire engage the culture and bring the transformative power of God's Word where it is most needed. Today, we invite you to join Bishop Robert Barron as he preaches the gospel and shares the warmth and light of Christ with each one of us.
Peace be with you, and a happy, blessed Easter to everybody. Friends, it's a weird thing in my own life, but I've always liked to visit the graves of famous people. I don't know why precisely. Maybe it's a sense of history, a sense of connection across the ages. Maybe it's a form of paying tribute, honoring their memory. Whatever it is, something has always drawn me to these places, to the graves and tombs of famous people. I've done a lot of traveling around the world in my life, and whenever I come into a new place or new city, my first question is usually, well, who's buried here? Whose grave can I visit? And then I make a beeline to those places. When I was a student in Washington, D.C. many years ago, I used to love to visit that little ridge just below the Custis Lee Mansion where the Kennedy brothers are buried. So, of course, the whole Arlington Cemetery stretches out below you, but that little ridge just below the home from which Robert E. Lee left to fight the Civil War, a home that was connected to George Washington's family. Right below that house is that little area where the Kennedy brothers are. And I used to go and visit their graves, and I would sit for a long time and look kind of wistfully out at the city. I love that sight. When I was a student some years later in Paris, I loved to go to the Montparnasse Cemetery, right behind where I live. It's just maybe a 5-minute walk from where I lived. There, Samuel Beckett, the great Irish playwright, was buried, as was Jean-Paul Sartre, the existentialist philosopher. Not a man I agree with very much, but, a great philosophical figure. But the treasure trove of Parisian burial grounds is the Père Lachaise Cemetery. That's a place I visited frequently as well. There you find, it's like a city. It's a city of the dead, this massive cemetery. You find the graves of Abelard and Eloise, the famous kind of star-crossed couple from the Middle Ages. Abelard really is the reason Paris became a great city. You find the grave of Jim Morrison there, if you like rock and roll, right? The lead singer for The Doors, who died in Paris and is buried there. The grave of Chopin, the great pianist. Oscar Wilde is buried there. I spent hours at Père Lachaise, just kind of wandering around, and there'd be a lot of people that you wouldn't recognize, but then almost every row there'd be someone of, kind of world historical importance. Just recently, I was in Rome. I said Mass with a friend of mine down in the crypt of St. Peter's, not far from the tomb of Pope Paul VI. We prayed at the graves of Pius XII, went upstairs, prayed at the grave of John the 23rd, and, of course, my great hero, John Paul II. Spent a long time, I remember, in front of the grave of John Paul II, just musing on what he meant to the whole church, what he's meant to me. And think about this. Whenever you go to St. Peter's, what you're visiting, basically, is a giant grave monument. It's the most famous grave monument in the world. So St. Peter is buried there on that side of the Vatican Hill, and eventually a huge basilica under Constantine was built there. That was torn down, and the one we have now was built in the 16th century. So you're visiting basically a grave. I remember when I was in Washington many years ago, I used to visit the tomb of George Washington out at Mount Vernon. Then if you press inland a little bit, you can visit the little grave where Thomas Jefferson lies, this hugely important figure, but lies in a pretty modest grave. If you wander a bit further in Virginia, you'll come to the Washington Lee University, where the tomb of Robert E. Lee can be found. I remember I was on retreat one time years ago in southern Indiana, St. Meinrad. And not far from there is the Lincoln Boyhood Memorial, because the Lincoln family lived there when Abraham Lincoln was a teenager. But the most moving part of it, there's a beautiful little cemetery, at the heart of which is the tomb of Nancy Hanks, Abraham Lincoln's mother. There is a very beautiful, very simple tomb, and it's covered in Lincoln pennies. People have thrown Lincoln pennies on top of it. And I've always found it very peaceful, very moving. Another one not too far from there is the grave of Thomas Merton, one of my spiritual heroes. Remember, I was down at Gethsemane Abbey where he lived, and I was giving talks to the monks, and I was in a guest room, in the guest wing. And I opened the window to the room, and it directly overlooked the cemetery. And I could see Merton's grave from my room. I just spent long periods of time gazing out at his grave and the other ones. Now, you're wondering, why is this man leading me on this sort of macabre meditation on graves on Easter Sunday? Well, there's a reason we're drawn to them, and I've mentioned some above. But also, there's a sense of peace, of fulfillment, of something ended. That's why we love to meditate and muse and sort of ponder at graves. Peaceful, serene, complete. The one thing you would never expect in a cemetery or a grave is action or novelty. See, and that's why the grave at the center of our gospel today, at the center of Christianity, is so weird and powerful. We hear that 3 women come to the tomb of Jesus. As we'd expect any visitor to any grave to come, they have their oils with them. They intend to anoint the body of Jesus. They're anticipating, perhaps weeping at the grave, perhaps sitting in reverential silence, perhaps quietly musing on the life and words of their friend, maybe through their tears expressing their admiration for him, the tragedy of his death. I mean, that's how they're going to the tomb, right? How we would go to the tomb of someone that we deeply admired. How we might even today go to the tomb of a famous person. Let's sit around quietly and muse on what his life has meant. But this is no ordinary grave. And everything, friends, is going to hinge upon this. The first thing they notice is that the stone has been rolled away. Now, this could have been the result of grave robbers, of somebody trying to break in and desecrate the tomb, and they consider that possibility. But what's beginning to dawn on them is that this rolling away is not the result of somebody breaking in, but of somebody breaking out. They look in and they see a young man, and they're frightened out of their wits. See, again, we've heard this story a million times, but get back now to the moment and hear these words as though for the first time. They're frightened. Well, of course they are. Can you imagine you come to a grave, to a cemetery, and you walk into a tomb like a mausoleum, and you're fully expecting to see a dead body, a coffin or something, and what do you see? Someone standing there, alive and well. But that's not the end of their surprise. For this strange person announces that the Jesus whom they seek is not there, that he's been raised up and will go ahead of them into Galilee. Can you imagine? That's what you see and you hear as you come to the grave in this wistful, mournful, elegiac spirit. This is what happens. So then it says, understandably enough, listen, They made their way out and fled from the tomb, bewildered and trembling. And because of their great fear, they said nothing to anyone. You know, that rings so true, doesn't it? This is not some literary invention. That rings very true to me of what it must have been like to come in one attitude to that tomb and then to see what they saw. My point is, this grave is not the source of peace and rest and calm, thoughtful meditation. That's what I love to do at graves, what a lot of us like to do. This grave, though, is a source of terror and upheaval. Ordinary graves, as I said, are places of finality and inevitability. This grave is a place of novelty so shocking that it frightens people out of their wits. See, to get that is to get Christianity. From this grave of Jesus, we learn to our shock that everything we took to be the case about life, about the world, is in fact not the case. That the supposed laws of nature aren't really laws after all. That what's always moved this way now moves that way. You see why they're afraid, why they run from this place. What have they begun to sense? That God is the enemy of death. And that he's shown us his power over death in the most unambiguous way. That our lives oughtn't to be dominated by the fear of death. And we see the proof of this in the most vivid way imaginable. You know, I've said this before, I know, to you, but I'll say it again on this Easter Sunday. Some people think they'll make the resurrection more intelligible, more acceptable to modern people, if they allegorize it away, turning it into a vague symbol of the perdurance of Jesus' cause. See, friends, if that were true, his grave wouldn't be frightening. It would be like the grave of any ordinary hero. Sad, wistful, reassuring. Notice, please, and this is really interesting, just from an historical standpoint, no cult of Jesus' tomb ever developed in Christianity. People don't go to the tomb of Jesus. They did in the early days, just to sit and muse on what his life meant. They didn't look back on him with a sort of easy wistfulness. Rather, they were surprised, shocked out of their wits, and turned upside down by the grave of Jesus. A last word about the man in the white garment. Remember last week I mentioned to you how the man that ran away and left his garment in the hands of Jesus' enemies, ran naked into the night, stands for the baptized person, you and me, who runs away at the moment of truth. The man whom the women see in the tomb who announces the resurrection is wearing the same garment, the same word, syndona in the Greek. Who is he? He's all of us symbolically who've now recovered our faith and standing in the very weird and frightening tomb of Jesus, announce to the world his resurrection. That's the call that all of us have to evangelization. Have a beautiful, blessed Easter today, friends, and allow yourself, like these women, to be frightened out of your wits by the empty tomb of Jesus. And God bless you.
Thank you for listening to this week's homily from Bishop Robert Barron. For more resources from Bishop Barron, please visit wordonfire.org.